Anyway, I'm honoured, I'm still Michael Rosen, I'm honoured to present our first keynote speaker, Tim Scanlon. I'm going to do so, however, extremely briefly for 4 reasons. First, it's obviously unnecessary. If you don't know who Tim Scanlon is, I think you may be in the wrong auditorium. Second, it would be impossible to list all of his achievements in a reasonable space, so I'm just going to say that he's Harvard's Alford Professor of Natural Religion, Moral Philosophy and Civil Polity Emeritus, and leave it there. Thirdly, he would find it acutely embarrassing. Of the great philosophers known to me, I can think of only one who can match him for humility and self-effacement, and that's his late friend and colleague John Rawls himself. But finally, and most importantly, we have only a limited time at our disposal, and Tim and you should fill it, not me. But I must express our gratitude to Tim for agreeing to speak to us this evening. You might think that as Alford Professor of Natural Religion, Moral Philosophy and Civil Polity Emeritus, there would be few demands on his time. If so, you do not know the man. Tim, as he's pointed out in print, is not a Kantian, but his natural religion, like Kant's, involves obedience to duty, that stern daughter of the voice of God, as Wordsworth called it. He has just returned from a visit to Hong Kong, which he spent apparently largely in his hotel room, working on his lecture on the ethics of healthcare, a contribution to a festschrift for a friend, and this lecture. I don't presume to judge whether he might reasonably have rejected our invitation, its evident contribution to the overall good notwithstanding. So I'm just going to say that we're all extremely grateful that he didn't. He's going to speak to us on Rawls on Equality, looking back at a theory of justice. Tim, thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for saying no more than that. In 1998, I had the good luck to give a seminar in theories of justice with Rawls and Amartya Sen. And in one section of that seminar, in which we were discussing equality, it occurred to me that inequality is not always objectionable. For example, it seemed to me on that occasion, it's not objectionable that women have greater life expectancy than men. So I volunteered to write a paper on equality for the next session of the seminar. It turned out, given the topic of the seminar, naturally, to be a paper on Rawls's theory of justice. It set out to identify the various points at which ideas of equality figure in a theory of justice, either as inputs structuring the theory or as conclusions drawn from it, and to consider how the structure of Rawls's theory supports or clarifies these ideas. This paper developed into my 1996 paper, The Diversity of Objections to Inequality, and then through a series of increasingly long unpublished papers into Why Does Inequality Matter?, a short book that I just published last year. I hope it won't seem too self-referential if I devote this lecture to a kind of reverse engineering, looking back at the ways in which my views on equality have deviated from their Rawlsian origins, and considering what the reasons for these deviations tell us about Rawls's theory or about my own mistakes in deviating from it. I recently received an email inviting me to contribute to a conference on justice. And in the email, the person inviting me said that it would be particularly interesting to have my contribution as a rebellious student of John Rawls. I don't think of myself as rebellious, but perhaps after this lecture, you can judge how rebellious I am. In my book, I list 6 reasons for objecting to inequality in various forms. It's objectionable if it involves humiliating differences in status, objectionable if it gives some people unacceptable forms of control over the lives of others, objectionable if it undermines equality of opportunity, objectionable if it undermines the fairness of political institutions, objectionable if it results from a policy that can be justified only by giving unequal weight to the identical interests of different people, and objectionable if it arises from economic institutions that are unfair. I think of this view as distinctly Rawlsian, not only in its origins, but also in its content. It does, however, differ from Rawls's view in a number of ways. To mention only 2 large-scale differences at the start, first, I focus on a society in which there is unjust inequality. and I ask why this inequality is objectionable. Rawls, by contrast, in A Theory of Justice, is focusing on a just society, or imagining one, and describing how the inequality occurring in it could be just. Second, my view is avowedly pluralistic and makes no claim to completeness. I'm not going to object if somebody says, well, there's another objection to inequality that you haven't covered. Whereas Rawls gives us a unified theory of justice that in many ways seems to aspire to completeness. In what ways is Rawls's theory of justice and equality unified? First, the theory is unified in taking the basic structure of a society as the single subject of justice. This is a view that I share and rely upon. The basic constitutional and legal framework of a society, as Rawls recognized, raises special problems of justification for at least two reasons. First, these institutions can't be justified on the basis of individual transactions, such as giving consent, entering into agreements, and so on, because such transactions legitimate their outcomes only if they are made under the appropriate background conditions, which the basic structure itself supplies. Second, the justification for such a framework has to take into account not only the character of individual transactions that occur within it, but also the cumulative effects of the operation of these institutions over time. This is a point, for example, conceded by Nozick's Lockean proviso. The answer to the question of how much is included in a basic structure, a much disputed question because the idea of a basic structure is somewhat vague, but the answer to the question seems to me to be something one works out by seeing what's required by these two reasons. That's what's required in order to provide an adequate background structure, what's required in order to take fully into account the effects of the various interactions within it as they build up and have cumulative impact over time. Rawls's theory also seems to be unified in offering a single set of principles that are intended to serve as all-encompassing standards for assessing complaints against a basic structure. This is implicit in what Rawls calls the natural duty of justice, which requires us to comply with institutions that exist and are just insofar as they apply to us. Why is that? That's the first half. I'm leaving out the second half, which is the more difficult one, to try to create such institutions where they don't yet exist. But the first half seems to me just a corollary of the role for principles of justice, that as all-encompassing standards for assessing basic structures. If an institution claims to apply to me and claims that I'm required to do X, if it's just, that is, if I don't have any complaint against it as measured by the principles of justice, then it follows that I've got to do what it tells me to do, and I have no complaint. These principles, the ones that are supposed to be all-encompassing standards for complaints against a basic structure, concern equality or inequality in the prospects of representative individuals in different social positions over a complete life, as measured by what Rawls calls primary social goods. This further way of framing the question is unifying in two respects. First, it considers the cumulative effect on individuals' expectations of all the various aspects of the basic structure: political rights, distribution of income, provision of public services and various public goods, and so on. And then it assesses these effects in terms of an index of these goods, presumably balancing gains in terms of some of these goods against losses in terms of others. This apparent unity in the initial statement of the view, however, is modified as the theory is developed, even within a theory of justice. Basic liberties are given priority over other goods by being separated out as the subject of the first principle. Fair equality of opportunity is also given priority over the second principle. A special place is given to maintaining the fair value of political liberties. And the social bases of self-respect is at least mentioned as the most important of the primary social goods, suggesting that it has a further kind of priority, although it's left vague exactly what effect this has. Let me begin by looking at this last point, by discussing the relation between Rawls' discussion of self-respect and the objection to inequality that I discuss in the chapter of my book on unequal status. In that chapter, I consider three kinds of unequal status: Unequal status due to the prevalence of discriminatory attitudes such as racism, sexism, and other forms of prejudice. Second, unequal status due to economic inequality, the inequality between the rich and the poor, and and unequal status resulting from meritocratic institutions. A common feature of these examples is that all these forms of unequal status depend on the existence of attitudes widely held in society that assign forms of significance to various characteristics of persons. Forms of significance that these characteristics do not, in fact, have. Racism involves taking facts about people's skin color or ancestry as reasons for regarding them as undesirable as family members, co-workers, neighbors, or even persons to sit next to in a restaurant or on a bus, for seeing them as unsuitable for positions of responsibility and authority, for taking their interests less seriously in the determination of social policy, and even for denying them basic civil and political rights. Being poor can involve a similar lack of social status if a certain kind of importance is attached to being rich and having the accoutrements that go with it. So the badness of the status depends not simply on some people having more money than others, but on the social significance that's attached to that. Finally, in Michael Young, in his famous book, The Rise of the Meritocracy, which may have really invented that term, I'm not sure, Leif can tell me whether that's true, he looked into this, he imagines a society that would be perfectly meritocratic, but nonetheless might lead to a partition of society according to various degrees of success, with consequent feelings of superiority and inferiority. As Leif mentioned, our own society is not close to being fully meritocratic. Nonetheless, that a form of this partitioning seems to me to exist nonetheless, insofar as people attach a certain kind of significance, I think the wrong and an excessive kind of significance, to the forms of success that the competitive system defines. As Thomas Nagel said long ago in an article on affirmative action, when racial and sexual injustice have been reduced, we will still be left with the great inequality of the smart and the dumb. All of these forms of status inequality involve what I call errors of evaluation. They depend on the existence of widely held attitudes, as I said, that assign certain properties of individuals forms of significance that they don't in fact have. But these different forms of status inequality differ in several important ways. First, discriminatory attitudes arising from meritocracy. Now, in the light of what Leif said, I should pause there. See, this is the thing about teaching in great universities. You get good students, but then your students, say things that show that you were wrong in what you said. I didn't read Leif's paper before I wrote mine. So I have to take account of the fact that meritocracy, like liberalism, can be used in more positive or more negative ways. Right? So one way of understanding meritocracy is it's a society in which people are chosen for positions of advantage on the basis of characteristics that actually justify giving them those positions. There's no prejudice, no cheating, no nepotism, and so on. That seems by itself perfectly benign, and I think that in a way, that was the kind of meritocracy that was the premise of Michael Young's book. He said, look, he was writing in Britain in the 1950s, there's a pressure to make education fairer, more egalitarian, less class-bound, and so on. So he saw this as a push to achieve meritocracy in this, let's say, relatively positive and benign sense, in which everybody has a fair shot, right? But the point of Young's book was to say, look, if you carry that to the extreme and it all works perfectly, then some people will do better than others, and they will know that they really lost. It wasn't that somebody was cheating. It wasn't that they didn't have a chance. They had a chance, but they didn't win. And he imagines a society in which there's a kind of pathology because, understandably, as we might say, people attach a lot of significance to these differences. They don't particularly want to associate with people who've done less well than they are, or have their children marry them, or live next door to them, maybe even, and things like that. So here I'm distinguishing between meritocracy in the sense that's basically identified with achieving equality of opportunity on the one hand, and meritocracy in the pejorative sense, which adds to that the kind of pathological evaluative error that I'm saying is characteristic of all the forms of status inequality that I'm discussing. As I say, but these forms of status inequality differ in important ways. Now I can go back to the sentence that I had to depart from in order to respond to Leif. Discriminatory attitudes arising from meritocracy in the narrow or benign sense assign significance to forms of success which in themselves are worth valuing. It's worth succeeding in discovering the unified theory of physics, or succeeding in discovering the cure for cancer, or succeeding in becoming a good and skillful judge or politician. These are things I'm going to stipulate are worth striving for. But the problem arises when these forms of accomplishment are not merely valued, but are assigned excessive and mistaken importance as marking forms of social superiority and inferiority. Racism, by contrast, assigns significance to properties that have no such independent value. And in addition, as I've said, racism and sexism compound evaluative errors of this kind by adding in the moral error of denying the people to whom they assign these properties political and civil rights. So that this is a variety among the species of status inequality that I'm discussing, which is going to be relevant for my discussion of the way Rawls talks about matters, which I will now turn to. So, Rawls on the social bases of self-respect. Although Rawls says at a number of points that racist and sexist discrimination are obviously unjust, he doesn't discuss these at length. This is because his concern is with a just society and with whether inequalities in income, and especially in education and what he calls powers and prerogatives of office that would be permitted by his difference principle, would give rise to what he calls a loss of self-respect, by which he means, quote, a sense of one's value and a secure sense that one's conception of the good, one's plan of life, is worth carrying out. If the social bases of self-respect include widespread attitudes in the society affirming one's worth in this sense, then the existence of negative attitudes of the kinds that I have described would constitute a lack of such a social basis. But the emphasis Rawls places on the value of one's accomplishments and the excellence of one's plan of life is most relevant to and most directly threatened by discriminatory attitudes of the third kind I mentioned, that is, those involved with meritocracy. This reflects a difference in our approaches to equality. When one starts, as I do in my book, with the question of why inequality is objectionable, one is led to focus on a wider range of forms of inequality than one starts, as Rawls does, with the question, what inequality could be just? This is not a criticism of Rawls or an indication that the answers he arrives at don't tell us anything about cases of injustice, but they just explain why he's talking about one thing rather than the broader range of phenomena that I'm interested in here. This difference in approach is also relevant to the factors Rawls mentions as preventing a loss of self-respect. These are two. The first is the existence of a status of equal citizenship that is widely acknowledged, and second, what he calls a tendency to form non-comparing groups. I'll have most to say about the second, but just let me say one word about the first. If everyone in the society believes that everyone else has the status of equal citizenship, that would rule out, as it were, the political dimension of racism and sexism, although it wouldn't necessarily rule out what I called its evaluative dimension. But I'm not so sure that even a well-established sense of equal citizenship would be a bulwark against the, you might say, pathologies of meritocracy, as one can continue to believe that everyone has the vote, everyone is an equal citizen, everyone counts is of equal importance in the justification of social institutions, while still having, so I might say, attaching false importance to the kinds of success that a meritocratic system would allow for. But what I mainly want to talk about here is the other factor that Rawls mentions as possibly limiting damage to self-respect in the society that he's talking about, which is the tendency to form non-comparing groups. Rawls writes that, quote, individuals have varying capacities and abilities, and what seems interesting and challenging to some will not seem so to others. Yet in a well-ordered society anyway, there are a variety of communities and associations, and the members of each have their own ideals appropriately matched to their aspirations and talents. That's the end of the quote. So as long as each person has a community within which his or her abilities and mode of life is valued, one's self-respect or self-esteem will not be threatened. This might seem evasive, a way of avoiding a difficulty by concealing it, by saying, well, it's going to be like this, but people aren't going to notice it. But it's important, I think, that the differences in individual success and attainments that Rawls has in mind in a society of the kind he's talking about are not themselves objectionable or unjust in any way. What is being prevented by separating people into non-comparing groups is just a natural but unavoidable side effect of these, as he imagines, otherwise unobjectionable and probably unavoidable differences as they would arise in a just society. But this same tendency to form non-comparing groups exists in unjust societies as well, with less benign effects. When people tend to live and associate with those who are like them in ability, accomplishment, and interests, and of course also in wealth and income, this leads the rich and the better educated and more successful to be less aware of and even unsympathetic to the lives of those who are poorer, less well-educated, and less successful, with corrupting effects on the political life of the society. This, again, isn't a criticism of Rawls, whom I'm sure would agree with what I've just said. My point is just that a phenomenon that might have a benign role in a just society of the kind Rawls is discussing can have a corrupting effect in an unjust one like our own. I've suggested that all three kinds of discriminatory attitudes consist at base in mistakes in evaluation. I've not proposed any way to prevent such errors in evaluation from taking hold or any way of reversing them once they do. It does seem to me, however, that one hope one might have in this direction lies in the opposite of the tendency to form non-comparing groups. One can at least hope that greater interaction with those who differ from us in these ways could undermine these false evaluative beliefs. At least, maintaining the separateness of groups can only serve to perpetuate them, as Danielle Allen has persuasively argued in her paper Toward a Connected Society, and a book also on that. Is that right? Yeah. Coming soon. Anyway, okay. I've mentioned, now I'm changing the subject to equality of opportunity. I've mentioned as one further reason for objecting to inequality of income and wealth, the fact that it can undermine equality of opportunity. In Rawls's theory, this reason for objecting to and even limiting inequality is expressed in the fact that what he calls fair equality of opportunity is a constraint, a rider, as he calls it, on the permissibility of inequalities that can be licensed by the difference principle. Since fair equality of opportunity is a very demanding requirement, this can be a very strong limit on permissible inequality. Rawls says relatively little, however, about what gives inequality of opportunity the status, how it is to be defended, and not much about how it is to be understood. So I want to take up that task here briefly. In my book, I analyze equality of opportunity as part of a three-level response to complaints about inequality. The first level is an institutional justification for having a position to which some kind of special benefits, either privileges or opportunities, powers, recognition, or perhaps even income, are attached. The second is a claim that the process through which individuals were selected for occupying this position is procedurally fair. That is to say, individuals were selected for this position on the basis of relevant qualifications. The third claim, which is the essence of Rawls's idea of fair equality of opportunity, is a claim of what I call substantive opportunity, that no one can complain about not having had adequate opportunity to acquire qualifications required to do better in the process of selection. This structure makes it clear that what Rawls calls fair equality of opportunity, and what I'm calling procedural fairness and substantive opportunity, is not itself even if it were achieved, which it's not, but even if it were achieved, would not be itself a justification for inequality. This justification has to be provided independently in the form of what I'm calling institutional justification. I will assume, for purposes of this discussion, which I think Rawls probably would also assume, that this institutional justification is based on the benefits that are claimed that flow from having a position of the kind in question, provided that it's filled by individuals of the appropriate sort. If the benefits that are supposed to flow from having this position of advantage didn't require that those who occupy it have any special abilities or character, then there would be no reason for any one individual to have the position rather than any other. So selection by lottery or taking turns would seem to be called for rather than some kind of competitive process of selection according to merit. But if the benefits of having the position do depend on the abilities of the individuals who hold it, then it follows that individuals must be selected on the basis of these abilities. Otherwise, the position wouldn't be being administered in a way that is actually supported by the justification that has been offered for it. So the requirement of procedural fairness, selection according to merit, whatever you want to call it, is simply a corollary of institutional justification and requires no separate argument. This aspect of fair equality of opportunity, procedural fairness, is not so much a rider or a limitation on the difference principle, but simply an implication of the way that principle requires inequalities to be justified. As Tommy Shelby says in a paper on Rawls on equality of opportunity, it's simply an application of what Rawls calls the requirement of formal justice. That is, that institutions be administered in the way that actually is required by the way they are set up and justified. This analysis may be simple and obvious, I hope it's obvious, but it has several important implications that you might not have noticed. The first is that the notion of ability that's relevant to procedural fairness is institution dependent. It depends on the justifying aims of the institution, of which the position in question is a part, and on the way that institution is organized to promote those aims. If a job requires moving heavy objects, then physical strength is a qualification. But if the lifting can be done with a forklift machine or some other mechanical aid, this won't be true. If the position requires writing computer code, then programming knowledge is a qualification. Otherwise, if it's farmed out to India or something, it's not. It follows from this, I think, more controversially, that race and gender are not always ruled out as relevant considerations for selection. In a society marked by serious discrimination on the basis of race and gender, alleviating the effects of this discrimination is a legitimate goal both of the state and of other institutions, such as firms and universities. And race and gender can therefore be relevant in the selection of candidates for various positions, insofar as this is necessary to promote that goal. This isn't discrimination in the sense I discussed previously in talking about status inequality, because it does not label anyone inferior and doesn't assign these characteristics some kind of significance that they don't have under the conditions in question. This point brings out, I think, an important advantage of a pluralistic approach to the questions we're discussing. People who are subject to negative characterizations of the kind I've talked about in discussing unequal status are likely, as a result, to be wronged in other ways. Their interests will not be given the same weight as comparable interests of others in determining social policy, violating what I call the requirement of equal concern. They will be denied equality of opportunity because they won't be considered on their merits for positions of influence and advantage. And they may be, as I've said, even be denied basic civil and political rights. It's important, however, to see that these wrongs are all distinct and different from the basic wrong of being subject to false negative attitudes, even though that brings on these other wrongs in its train. These attitudes, the false negative attitudes, assign individual characteristics a significance that they do not in fact have. So there is an element of truth in Chief Justice Roberts' frequent observation that what we should do is simply stop treating race as relevant. But from the fact that race doesn't have the negative significance that racism attributes to it, it doesn't follow that in a society marked by racism, race is also irrelevant in the determination of social policy or in the selection of individuals for various positions. In such a society, remedying the effects of racism is a legitimate aim of social policy, and insofar as this is so, it can have a legitimate role in justifying these policies. To claim that it has this significance isn't to claim, erroneously, that it has the kind of significance that racism falsely attributes to it. I said earlier that procedural fairness follows from institutional justification and therefore requires no further argument. Sorry. Oh, sorry. No, forget that sentence. I asked the jury and the audience to ignore that sentence. The dependence of criteria of selection on the structure of institutions also raises further questions. If an institution could be organized differently so that it would depend less on special abilities and would therefore provide employment to a wider range of individuals, is there a reason to do this? Doing so might be less efficient insofar as output is concerned, but why is output efficiency in this sense the only benefit to be taken into account in justifying institutions and the way they are organized? Once one recognizes, however, that the interests of producers, for example, in having access to jobs and having access maybe to more meaningful jobs, has some role in the justification of institutions, a point which I think is extremely difficult to deny once one thinks of it, this has general implications beyond equality of opportunity about how to balance the interests of consumers on the one hand and those of producers in justifying institutions, and how to design institutions so that they will be inclined to adjust and be reflective of the proper balance between these. So this is a case where there's a small point that is, well, the justification of institutions depends upon, the criteria for selection depends upon how the institutions are organized. They can be organized in different ways to give more people opportunities or give fewer people opportunities. So you've got to take into account the value of those opportunities among other things, in deciding how to organize them. That's, as I say, seems very hard to deny once you mention it, but it's the tip of an iceberg that I don't know how to deal with, and I don't know how to deal with the rest of it because it's very, very difficult. Perhaps Lucas Stancic and Gina Schouten will answer this question in the session tomorrow afternoon. I'm hoping that they might. I turn now away from procedural fairness and the implications of its institutional dependence to what I called substantive opportunity, which, as I said, is the distinguishing mark of Rawls's particular idea of fair equality of opportunity, differentiating that idea from mere careers open to talent. Here there are two broad questions. Here there are two broad questions: how the stronger requirement should be interpreted and how it's justified. Taking first the question of interpretation, Rawls states fair equality of opportunity as the requirement that, quote, those who are at the same level of talent and ability and have the same willingness to use them should have the same prospects of success regardless of their initial place in the social system. This is page 73 of the Theory of Justice. But more needs to be said here about how both ability and willingness are understood. It may seem that these are personal characteristics of individuals that merit reward, but this is a mistake. And let me say first something about the case of ability and then something more about willingness. I said earlier that the kind of ability relative to equality of opportunity is institutional dependent. I gave the examples concerning employment, lifting things with a forklift truck or being able to write computer code. But the same thing is true of education, as Joey Fishkin points out in his recent book, Bottlenecks. The idea of ability that's needed to succeed at Harvard, say, depends on what's presupposed in its introductory courses. If all these courses required knowledge of French, we could weed out people on the basis of whether they knew French. If they didn't know it, like me, we wouldn't have much chance of success. Similarly, going farther down, pushing farther down, the kind of ability required to succeed in elementary school depends on the kind of instruction is offered and on the aids to intellectual development that the school, or maybe even the home before that, can provide. More generally, Fishkin argues, there's no notion of ability independent of the level of educational technology available in the society, as we might call it, that can serve as a standard for determining the kind of education and other conditions that substantive opportunity requires, in the way that Rawls' system seems to demand. Rawls says people who have the same ability and the same willingness to develop them should have the same opportunities. That means we've got to offer education that will allow those who have the same ability to do well to the same degree. But that presupposes that ability can be understood independent of what kind of educational resources we have. Joey will tell you more about that tomorrow in the afternoon, so stay tuned. But the implication seems to be that what substantive opportunity requires is that education and developmental conditions more generally that are available to the rich, whatever they may be in the society, given this level of educational technology, must be made available to all, whatever these may be. So the rich set the tune. This sets a high standard for achieving substantive opportunity. Even leaving Fishkin's point aside, however, the costs of achieving substantive opportunities already seemed very high, and this raises the question of how it's justified. Richard Arneson argued, for example, that it's not justified as a limit on the inequalities that the difference principle can permit. If the economic expectations of the worst off could be improved by allowing greater inequality, to refuse to do this on the ground that it would interfere with equality of opportunity, Arneson argues, would be to favor the talented members of the worst off group over the less talented ones. And this, he says, seems a kind of discrimination. And Rawls himself says in Justice is Fairness, a restatement, that he is unsure how far the priority of fair equality of opportunity is justified. He doesn't elaborate on this, but I assume that what he has in mind is the cost of achieving substantive opportunity. I think that this objection has somewhat less force than it may appear to have. Contrary to what Arneson seems to suggest, achieving substantive opportunity is not mainly a matter of favoring the it's not a matter of favoring the interests of some children over those of others. The difficulty and cost of achieving substantive opportunity lies rather in the difficulty of providing all children with the kind of developmental and educational conditions that are required to develop whatever talents they may have. The objection may be then not an interpersonal one, but as it were an intrapersonal one, that the opportunity to develop your talents in this way is just one kind of good. The level of communicative technology is not fully developed here. The choice is not between favoring some people and favoring others, but a matter of choosing between competing interests of a single person, whether to spend tax money on improving education or leave families with more income to spend however they wish. What Rawls says in A Theory of Justice points toward two different responses to this question, which I will just identify for your further consideration. The first is that it is a requirement of justice that positions of advantage in a society should be open to all. This is what's suggested by the fact that equality of opportunity appears as a rider on permissible inequalities justified by the difference principle. But the question is why justice should require this. I'm not saying that can't be answered, but there's the question. A second idea is that those who are denied the opportunity to develop skills and to hold positions in which these skills are exercised are deprived of an important form of human good. Rawls writes, for example, that the prospects of culture and achievement should be available to all regardless of their social position. This is an idea of self-realization, you might say, and it would seem to apply to opportunities to develop valuable skills of many kinds, not just those required to qualify for positions to which special advantages are attached, but also success in the arts or literature, or you can name whatever other forms of talent you might want to develop. Giving special weight to this goal, this goal of self-realization, might seem to involve an element of perfectionism, but it's not an implausible one on my view. But the point is just that the defense of spending the money on providing opportunities for realizing your talents rather than simply giving you more money might rest on the one hand as a claim of justice about otherwise you're going to be shut out of unequal opportunities. So that depends on the problem about equality. On the other hand, it might be justified on grounds of the duty of the role of the state in providing opportunities for self-realization, which is a different and broader goal. Let me turn now to the idea of willingness. Remember, Rawls said children or people with the same ability and the same willingness to use their abilities should have the same prospects of success. Rawls writes that even the willingness to make an effort, to try, and so to be deserving in the ordinary sense, is itself dependent on happy family and social circumstances. So that's on page 74 of the first edition. Sorry. This remark can be interpreted in a way that raises several difficulties. On this interpretation, which I will argue is mistaken, the relevance of a person's willingness or lack thereof depends on whether it was under a person's control rather than determined by outside causes, such as having been placed in happy family and social circumstances. Understood in this way, Rawls's remark invites the response that in denying the relevance of willingness, Rawls is denying that the children in question, particularly those who grow up in unfortunate circumstances, are not moral agents who are responsible for the choices they make. I suggest a different interpretation that avoids these problems. On this interpretation, which I take to be closer to Rawls's intent, although, having heard the earlier panel, I should qualify this as a way I was inclined to do by saying, I'd like to think it's closer to Rawls's intent. On the other hand, I'm willing to subscribe to it in part because I'm a committed compatibilist about free will. Rawls was enough of a Kantian to be less happy with compatibilism, and in any event, as a political liberal, he wouldn't want his defense to depend on any thesis about free will. So he might have that second reason for preferring my interpretation, namely because it avoids making his claim depend on any thesis about free will. But anyway, on my revised interpretation, willingness is not a positive feature of an individual that makes reward appropriate. The point is rather that a lack of willingness, that is, a failure to try, can undermine an individual's objection to not qualifying for some position of advantage, can only do this under appropriate conditions, under the right kind of background conditions. Given this way of understanding the point, it's misleading to focus on the effects of fortunate or happy family and social circumstances. The point is rather that if a failure to try is due to unfortunate family and social circumstances, that is to say, due to conditions for deciding for what to try for that are not good enough, then this failure does not undermine the person's objection to having less than others. What substantive opportunity requires is that each individual be placed in good enough conditions to decide whether to strive to develop the abilities to require for positions of advantage or to succeed in some other way. When this requirement is met, individuals who fail to try, who show a lack of willingness, have no complaint about their lack of success. This isn't because their failure to try is an independent fact about them that makes them undeserving. It rather simply flows from the fact that the basic structure has done enough for them by placing them in sufficiently good background conditions to make such a choice. To take the former view, that their failure to try makes them undeserving, is a kind of moralism that's all too prevalent in our society. Moralism of this kind is extremely inviting under unjust conditions, because it enables those who have done well in the competition for positions of advantage to feel that they are genuinely entitled to the benefits of their success and not required to make any sacrifice to make their success genuine and legitimating, because other people's failure was due to their faults. They don't want to recognize that other people's failure to try might have been due to unjust circumstances that they have an obligation to remedy. So Rawls's idea of the background conditions provided by the basic structure as a subject of justice is a crucial antidote to corrosive moralism of the kind I've just mentioned. It also makes clear that Rawls's position doesn't depend on any claim about free will. and doesn't involve denying that those who grow up in unfortunate circumstances are not morally responsible for the choices they make. To say that individuals who fail to qualify for positions of advantage because they didn't try hard to develop the relevant abilities, to say that such people who fail to qualify because they didn't try hard might still have a complaint about the conditions in which they were placed, is not to deny that they're responsible agents who may be open to prudential and even moral criticism for the choices that they have made. It can be true both at the same time that a poor person is open to criticism for not working harder in school, and that the basic structure is open to serious moral objection if it places individuals in conditions in which they are likely to choose in this way. There's no incompatibility between these two positions. Now, I've not said anything, I don't know if I could say much, about what constitutes good enough conditions for deciding what to strive for, the kind of conditions that substantive opportunity requires. I will mention under this heading only a few points. The first is that a young person isn't placed in good enough conditions if he or she is subjected to widespread attitudes according to which important forms of accomplishment are simply not appropriate for the kind of person he or she is, because, for example, of his or her race or gender. This is one of several ways, in which racism and sexism undermine equality of opportunity. It follows that if the basic structure is the subject of justice because it provides the necessary background conditions for individuals' choices, then a basic structure must include the existence or non-existence of prevailing attitudes of this kind. So at least part of what Jerry Cohen called the ethos of the society has to be included in the basic structure if the right kind of basic structure is to provide the right kind of background conditions to make individuals' choices meaningful. It also follows that the family is an obstacle to achieving substantive opportunity, not only because of economic differences between families, but also because of differences in the prevailing attitudes and values within families, which are difficult to change. Family cultures as diverse as the Roma and the Old Order Amish illustrate this point. Finally, this reminds us of the particular difficulty of avoiding the kind of evaluative errors through which a meritocratic society, by which I mean a society that's achieved fair equality of opportunity, can involve discrimination by turning into a meritocratic society in the pejorative sense. Substantive opportunity, as I've described it, requires that children grow up under conditions in which they are able to see the value of developing various abilities, and indeed inclined to take pleasure in and feel success in developing these abilities. The problem of discrimination that I discussed under the heading of meritocracy arises when these forms of accomplishment are seen as more important than they are. That is to say, not simply as things worth valuing, worth striving for, and worth feeling good about, but as the basis for feelings of social superiority and inferiority. The problem, which is distinctive to this case, is that it's not easy to encourage the former attitude, that these are things you should strive for and feel good about succeeding at, without also giving rise to the latter. It's hard to have the good kind of meritocracy without having its pathological twin. I turn now to the question of income inequality. It's widely believed that the current level of equality of income and wealth in the United States is morally objectionable. There are serious objections to this inequality based on its consequences. It corrupts our political system, and it undermines equality of opportunity, for example. But it seems to many, including me, that this level of inequality is also objectionable in itself, apart from its effects. And I now want to explore why this might be so. The objection might be that the inequality violates Rawls's difference principle, in addition to having these deleterious consequences. Something like this seems to me correct, as I will explain, and perhaps it's even implicitly conceded when those who would justify inequality do so by claiming that the benefits to the rich trickle down and benefit the poor by contributing to the growth of the economy. But maximizing the expectations of the worst off is a strong demand, and it's reasonable to ask for some clarification of its moral basis. I'm going to go back there, having mentioned trickle-down economics, and this is, I think, relevant to some of the discussion earlier today. and give you something that I've thought of using as an exam question in my political philosophy course, which is, what's the relation between Rawls's difference principle and the empirical claim that benefits to the rich trickle down and improve the prospects of the poor? Does Rawls's difference principle presuppose the truth of trickle-down economics? Does it deny the truth, or require us to deny the truth of trickle-down economics, or is it logically independent? It's logically independent, right? But people have a very strong tendency to assume the first through an error which might be called affirming the antecedent. That is, Rawls says, if, right, if certain inequalities couldn't be eliminated to the benefit of those who are worse, then those inequalities could be justified, right? But people somehow imagine that Rawls's theory is supposed to justify a lot of inequalities, such as what we're seeing. Therefore, the antecedent must be true. He must think the antecedent is true, which is completely false. But I couldn't resist it. I recommend it. I didn't actually use it as an exam. I use it on the dummy exam that I give them. I give them a whole lot of questions, and then I say, the exam will consist of a selection from these. But I didn't have the confidence in myself to actually use it on the real exam, because I was afraid that there'd be enough students in the class who wouldn't have gotten the point, that they would all fail the question. It's a good exam question because it's a simple yes or no answer, right? It's right or wrong. There isn't any error of judgment or whatever involved. Okay, back to the text. Maximizing the expectations of the worst off seems like a strong demand, and it's reasonable to ask for some clarification of its moral basis. As I've said in other work, the original position argument doesn't seem to me to be the most satisfactory way of doing this. Here I agree with some things that Leif has said. In considering the justification of inequalities, we need to consider the claims of people in different social positions. I think it's not helped in understanding these to try to collapse them into different possibilities for a single person who's trying to make a judgment about how he or she can do the best for him or herself that she can. In addition, if this person is supposed to measure the various possible outcomes in terms of an index of primary social goods, it seems to me that those primary social goods, including income and wealth, social bases of self-respect, powers and prerogatives of office, and political various liberties, refer to various different reasons for objecting to inequality. Combining them all into a similar index, it doesn't seem to me to be very helpful, although it may come to that in the end, as I will say. So it's worth asking what other kind of argument we might offer for something like the difference principle. And it seems to me there is such an argument that is implicit or maybe even explicit in a theory of justice. I'm not certain how far the argument succeeds, but it seems to me appropriate on this occasion to examine the sources of its appeal and the questions it raises or leaves open. This argument begins with the idea that significant inequalities in income generated by a basic structure need to be justified in some way. Otherwise, they would be arbitrary. This idea that inequality requires justification is familiar, even hackneyed, but it needs a clearer explanation. This claim is only prima facie. It doesn't actually require an equal distribution, but only that the features of a basic structure that generate significant economic inequality need a justification. The question then is what form this justification might take. Inequalities might be justified as arising from the exercise of pre-institutional property rights, or justified on the basis of a pre-institutional idea of what people deserve. But there seem to me good arguments, some implicit and many explicit in a theory of justice, for rejecting both of these alternatives. Property rights can figure in some ways in such a justification, but only if they are themselves justified in some other way. So what's left? The alternative seems to be to appeal to the interests of the members of the society. This is in line with Rawls's observation that he's conceiving of a society as a system of cooperation designed to advance, and I take it that means justified by the degree to which it does advance, the good of those taking part in it. The idea might be that features of a basic structure that generate significant inequality are arbitrary unless they somehow benefit members of the society other than those who are directly gaining from them. But I want to examine in these closing remarks a weaker requirement, that inequalities are justified only if they couldn't be eliminated in a way that would benefit those who have less. This is in line with the rationale for what Rawls calls the lexical difference principle. If a feature of a basic structure that gives greater income to some at the top couldn't be altered in a way that would shift this greater income to those who have less, then it wouldn't be reasonable to object to it on the ground I'm now considering, that it's unfair because it's arbitrary. After all, it benefits some people, and eliminating it wouldn't help anybody else. But to say that the features of a basic structure that generate such inequalities would not be objectionable on this particular ground of arbitrariness or unfairness is not to say that there would be no objection to these inequalities. They might well be objectionable on the ground of their consequences, such as their effects on the political system, on equality of opportunity, on equality of status, and so on. This point bears on the force and limits of Nozick's famous Chamberlain example. Its appeal lies in the fact that no defensible basic structure could forbid people from spending their income on basketball tickets if they wanted to. Nothing follows from this, however, about whether Wilt's income could be taxed. Nozick suggests that his opponents would want to tax Wilt's income simply to restore a pattern of equality. But this is tendentious. There are perfectly good reasons for taxation based on, for example, the need to pay for the maintenance of appropriate background conditions and the need to prevent ill effects of inequality of the kind that I've mentioned. I just want to conclude, this is the last page, by making a few brief points about this argument, about which much more needs to be said. First, I don't expect, and I don't think Rawls expected, that very significant inequality of income could be justified in this way. Insofar as inequality of this kind could be justified on the ground of the need to provide so-called incentives, I think this would be limited to what is required in order to make it the case that individuals have sufficient reason to do what's required in order to make institutions function, not on the basis of what's required in actually order to get them to do that. And this seems to me to be part of the best response to Jerry Cohen's criticism of Rawls. You might say it's an interpretation of the difference principle that's intermediate between what Cohen calls the strict and the lax interpretations. Second, in applying this argument, we should attend not only to the ways that a basic structure can hold, in applying this argument, we should attend to the ways that features of a basic structure hold down the incomes of workers, as well as those features that determine returns to those who do better. This will include measures such as transfer payments that shield workers from the effects of decisions, as well as factors determining their level of pay. Third, repeated application of the demand that inequality-generating features of a basic structure must be changed, if this can be done in a way that will shift the benefits to those who have less, will converge with Rawls's difference principle. The repeated application over time may converge to that point. But on this understanding, that principle is the basis for one particular objection to inequality among others, namely this distinctive kind of unfairness. It's not an all-encompassing standard, including all the possible ways of reasons for objecting to inequality. As I said at the beginning, this may indicate that the best way to understand a theory of justice is as offering a less unified theory than it first appears, since there are elements in the book that can account for all these other objections to inequality, other than the objection that seems to be best captured by the difference principle, which is a distinctive kind of distributive unfairness. Thank you very much.
So with that, I'm delighted to throw the floor open for questions. So who would like to begin? And could I ask you please to identify yourselves as you take the mic? Here, Eric Bierbaum.
Hi, Eric Bierbaum in the Department of Government and Social Studies. Tim, I want to see how rebellious a student you've really been in this talk. And so I see in the case of non-comparing groups, your argument seems to be one that when Rawls starts with a just society, non-comparing groups can be a persuasive argument, but can distort things under less than ideal conditions. So there it seems like you look rather potentially quite loyal, performing a sort of Rawlsian project, filling out underdetermined bits as they apply to society with serious injustices. But I take it that when you're thinking about the relationship between fair equality of opportunity and the difference principle, that you in the end can't see any principled reason for a sort of master priority, lexical priority in that kind of case. And that seems like the analysis you provide applies under fully ideal conditions. And there you might, maybe I've identified a bit of mischief there, I mean, more than a bit. And I think there are other cases, but that struck me as one of the more striking examples. Is the reading right where you are departing significantly in that way?
On your first point, I didn't say this because I cut down a longer paper to fit into the time slot. I'm not completely confident about the role of non-comparing groups even in a just society. It wouldn't have the corrosive effect I mentioned, but one of the things Rawls is concerned with is the stability of a just society over time. And as people are less aware of the situation of others, it would be more difficult to maintain. Now Rawls says, well, but they all believe, they all accept the principle of the equal importance of other people, and that society exists to serve everybody's interests, but still you need social pressure, social interaction to keep that alive. And so I'm not so completely confident about that. Now the second point was about
fair opportunity, difference principle.
Yeah.
No lexical priority.
Well, I said it's the justification for procedural fairness is a piece of cake, right? So the question of substantive opportunity, which is expensive. I'm inclined. I find it hard to spell out either of these arguments fully, although I think they're both quite strong. I think the idea that the positions in society that are most rewarded are ones that I'm simply not going to have a chance for because of the family in which I was born. That's a pretty strong complaint, it seems to me. So I think that's pretty strong. And then you can bolster that with the self-realization point that more generally I need to figure out who I am. So I think the case for it is quite strong, although maybe it's not an absolute.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'm Teresa Bejan from Oxford. So this is a question from a historian of political thought, but because I have you here, I really do I'm fascinated by in my own historical work on Rawls, I'm really interested in Rawls as teacher, and specifically teaching students at Harvard and teaching survey classes in the history of political thought at Harvard. And I'm just really fascinated how you might think of the experience of teaching excellent students at an elite and highly competitive university does or does not come in when theorizing meritocracy. And when you describe sort of good meritocracy, but for Michael Young, that's even the good meritocracy is bad, and then pathological meritocracy in the way that Leif was discussing earlier. I mean, this is just it's a question I would want to put to Rawls, but he's not here. So I want to invite you maybe to contextualize him and also contextualize yourself a bit.
Well, I'm happy to say how I feel about it, but I don't think I'm different from most of the other people in the room. But anyway, in the sort of upper level undergraduate/graduate course on political philosophy that I've been giving for many years, I have always had a 2-week session on status inequality, which we start by reading the second discourse of Rousseau and read the relevant sections of Rawls and other things on this topic, and I make exactly the argument in those lectures in that course. I make exactly the arguments that I've made here, and I put that in because I think that this is an audience that needs to hear that. I don't have any confidence that it does any good, but people do react to it. But yeah, so I do that for that reason. That's all I can say. Some react to it more strongly than others, I guess.
Rainer Voss from Frankfurt. Tim, can you really avoid moving towards a more unified account? Because as you yourself said, some of the inequalities that result from people being successful based on their talents, even if equality of opportunity is realized, some people object to the inequalities that result from that because they think they lead to objectionable differences in status, for example. And then your objections come into a conflict. The one uses a status objection and criticizes another. So isn't there a pull to more a unified account? That unified account wouldn't be able to use the language of inequality and equality as a criterion. So it would have to use the language of justice. It would have to say certain inequalities, if based on equality of opportunity, are status inequalities, but they're not unjust. So isn't that a reason to go for a more unified account of justice?
The question for me there is what role the idea of justice plays. Now, if justice is just a placeholder for the idea of a basic structure that nobody has any complaint against, then the conclusion is going to be a conclusion about justice. The question is, is there a more substantive idea of justice that I'm referring to in balancing out these different things? And that's what I sort of doubt. Now, I expressed a little bit of doubt in following on Leif's remarks about the original position, about the usefulness of trying to combine different dimensions of doing better and worse, having powers and prerogatives of office, having social bases of self-respect, having income and wealth, and so on, into one index. Certainly the idea of an index as something that was supposed to be maximized doesn't really seem to me to hold together, and I think Rawls really moved away from it. That's what I meant in my last slide by saying maybe the conclusion of my lecture is that Rawls's theory is in fact less unified than it appeared, because certainly in carrying out the kind of argument that I mentioned, you've got to decide, in deciding whether, let's say, a certain inequality benefits other people in a way that it justifies it, in particular justifies it given the possibility that it might have other deleterious effects. One has to perform some kind of balancing. I think just to say that doesn't provide a unity. So maybe a question of unity and disunity, which is I took as a kind of trope to organize this thing as a purely academic idea. But my idea is that kind of disunity is hard to avoid. And then to say, look, maybe that exists in Rawls too. He starts off with something that looks very unified, but then as he works on it, the individual parts kind of break loose.
Danielle, Allen. So I think you just answered my question in those comments, but let me share the question and see if that's the case. So one of the things that's striking to me about the argument that you made is the ways in which it has points of contact with arguments in a more Republican tradition about non-domination.
Right.
Point not across the board, but one of the features that is in some sense shared, it looks like to me, is an increasing focus on a diagnostic process. Mm-hmm. So you're asking questions about inequality and extending the argument that follows from the question about what the causes of inequality are, so that things that in some sense look naturalized in a sort of first pass on Rawls, like the concept of ability, become denaturalized because you see the social forces at work that are generating the thing that we have happened to call ability.
Right.
People do the same sort of thing with the concept of domination, right? Sort of explaining that. And so my question had been, in effect, does this sort of switch to a more persistent diagnostic process, in fact, dissolve the concept of the basic structure as a permanent and stable thing? And the points you just made about the lack of unity of sort of concept of justice and the way in which that relates to the concept of the basic structure seemed to me an answer to that question.
Yeah. Well, I think what I'm pluralist about are the diversity of reasons for objecting to the basic structure. As I said, the basic structure is kind of a vague thing, and to ask what it contains, you've got to ask, well, what's it supposed to do? And then in order to do that, it's got to contain more and more of these other things. So then the answer would be yes.
So that is pretty rebellious, Eric.
Okay, now we have 9 more minutes and 3 more questioners. Now 4 more questions. Tim, would you object if I gathered questions and asked you to deal with them all together?
Gather ye questions while ye may, I say.
No. This is justice is blind, and justice in this case is inclusive. So, questioners who are here, here, and here, please be brief.
So, team, I wonder if
you are.
So, sorry, Nir Eyal. I wonder about another potential difference between Rawls' approach and yours with respect to the roles in social associations and self-worth. As I understand Rawls, the central way in which the social associations foster or social basis of self-respect is they arrange for each of us to have a circle of people commenting on the worth of a shared pursuit that is friendly. So the sounding board that each of us meets is give them, if you will, recognition and acknowledges the worth of their plan. That seems to me, a good idea, benign, a great way to build self-respect. What it surely isn't is a way to avoid evaluative errors. It seems, on the contrary, to foster an evaluative error, because it cannot be the case that everybody's plans is at the same time kind of better than average plan. And that is the case whether the truth of the matter is that different plans of life are unequally worthy, whether they're equally worthy, or whether they're non-comparable. Either way, it cannot be the case that that's not an error.
Right.
Arthur Applebaum, Kennedy School. So Tim, I want to ask.
Could you use the mic, please, Arthur? I'm sure.
Arthur Applebaum, Kennedy School of Government. So Tim, I want to ask again, kind of following on your answer to Eric and Raina's question, the relationship between fair equality of opportunity and the difference principle. Something that you didn't mention, or at least you didn't emphasize, but I can't imagine you wouldn't subscribe to, is Rawls is very, very clear that fair equality of opportunity is a standard for the allocation of positions, but detached from the rewards to those positions. So what might seem as a constraint or a conflict actually nearly completely goes away if you understand that all we're giving out is neurosurgery internships. We're not giving out the salary attached to it, the social stat. Maybe what we need to do to satisfy other aspects of equality is to make it very shameful to become a neurosurgeon. Probably not. But once we completely take on board the view, Rawls's view, which I think is very clearly there, which is that equal opportunity is about the job that you're doing, not everything that comes with the job, then we have many more degrees of freedom to pursue the other aspects of equality that you and he care about. So my suggestion is that it's not a very binding constraint, and I wonder if you agree.
Yep. Yeah, didn't you have?
I'll cede my time to Tim.
Fine, okay, then gentleman here.
Tim, your view is there, you asked the question, is there a way to provide the benefit to an inequality without lesser inequality? And then you mentioned something I think about, well, maybe transfer payments. Yeah. Now my question is, Rawls is very, stresses that if we have fair background institutions, we can solve the problem of entitlements through pure procedural justice. Through pure procedural justice.
Yeah.
He wants the difference principle to work that way. is there going to be a tension in satisfying your change and preserving his desire, sort of, through the idea of entitlement, some nod to Nozick, through pure procedural justice? I always have worries about to what extent he can really rely on the idea that if you have just background institutions, so you can tax tax estates, that money goes into providing fair background institutions. But in general, it's not like jumping in each year and changing the tax code, at least in a well-ordered society. So I want to know if there's some tension you see between your modification and preserving the use of pure procedural justice, solve the problem of inequality.
Okay, I'll start and I'll work backwards in time.
You've got
I'm not
4 minutes
certain.
to do it.
I'm
Good
not
luck.
certain I understand the tension that you mean, Josh. It seems to me that, in Rawls's view, entitlements, including maybe even a basic income of some kind, are required in order to provide the appropriate background conditions, in order to shield people from the effects of other inequalities. So I'm now. If once you achieve that, you wouldn't need to monkey with it over time, so it wouldn't become a kind of political football. But it seems to me that that these things are required and need to be attended to is implicit in the idea of the basic structure as providing adequate background institutions. So maybe I'm not understanding your question. Okay, Arthur, I think that people are winning the positions as society defines them. So they're getting all these benefits. So I don't think. And the difficulty of achieving substantive opportunity is the difficulty of actually making it possible for people to develop their talents, the necessary talents, in the right way. And that would still be a problem no matter what the prizes are. So I don't think that lessens the ability. The evaluative error that I had in mind wasn't error about whether certain forms of success are actually good and failure bad. That's true. The evaluative error was attaching a false degree of significance to certain forms to saying it's not only worth developing the kind of talents that will make you a research scientist or something, but research scientists shouldn't feel that they would need to go to parties with or hang out with or whatever, countenance the possibility of their children marrying people who haven't succeeded in that hierarchy. So it's not the goodness or the badness of my degree of success. Inevitably, some of us are going to be successful, some of us aren't. It's what kind of social significance that has. Okay. Now I'm going to give a freebie, and just responding to something that Leif said about resentment, and picking up on something that Ben Friedman said to me during the break, which is this: what does the resentment of the people that Leif was talking about consist in? It may consist in feeling that they didn't have a fair chance. That was sort of what suggested by the way you put it. That would seem to suggest resentment against the rich, but a lot of the resentment seems more directed downward, and one wonders, why is there resentment in that direction? And I can only make a hypothesis, but my hypothesis is this, which causes a certain kind of problem for the view. That is, they resent those who have less because they're reacting to social progressives who want to do more for those people and claim that those people have been cheated, and that the people whose resentment we're talking about are not entitled to their gains because these other people didn't have a fair chance. So their resentment, and so they say, no, it's not that, it's that these people are lazy. And we resent such attention being given to them. But the reason for that is that they don't want to admit that the basic structure in which they're flourishing actually wasn't fair to begin with. Okay.
Well, only one more thing to do, and you're about to do it. Thank you very, very much.